Please take your seats. Our program will resume shortly. Please take your seats. Our program will resume shortly. Please take your seats. Our program will now resume. Please welcome our panelists, Senior Portfolio Manager and Managing Director of Tudor Investment Corporation, Ulrike Hoffmann-Bochadi. Partner and Chief Strategist of Clock Tower Group, Marco Papic. Founding Managing Partner of Qiming Venture Partners, Gary Reichel. Global Director of Tech Policy Research at Trivium China, Kendra Schaefer. And our moderator, Editorial Director of Bloomberg New Economy, Eric Schatzker.
Good afternoon, everyone. This begins the final portion of our program here on day 3 at the New Economy Forum. This is called the Geopolitics of Technology. I need to set the stage. We all know that trouble has been brewing between the United States and China over access to technology and intellectual property for years. Then, on October the 7th, the Biden administration raised the ante by barring American companies from exporting to China any software, equipment, or IP used in advanced computing chips and supercomputers. The new measures also barred U.S. persons from working for Chinese chip companies without a license from the U.S. government. The Commerce Department framed the export controls in national security terms, and I quote directly, "These items and capabilities are used by the People's Republic of China to produce advanced military systems, including weapons of mass destruction, improve the speed and accuracy of its military decision-making, planning, and logistics, as well as of its autonomous military systems, and commit human rights abuses." Folks, I want to know what you think. So it's time for another poll. Please pull out your phones and respond, if you would, to the following question. The recent U.S. ban on technology exports to China was A, necessary to maintain the West's dominance in semiconductors. This poll should be coming up. Poll. Do you guys see it on your phones? If you see it on your phone, there we go. A, necessary to maintain the West's dominance in semiconductors. B, just punishment for years of intellectual property theft. C, a thinly disguised attack on Chinese industry. D, the first salvo in a new Cold War. So, folks, while you answer that poll, I'm going to put the same question to our panelists. The ban on technology exports to China was what, Kendra?
E, all of the above.
Aha.
Is the answer.
That's not an option. You have to choose one. That's why these polls are devilishly difficult to answer.
Yeah, well, let me actually, I don't think my opinion necessarily matters. I mean, what's really interesting here is the stark divergence between the way that China perceives the semiconductor ban versus how the Biden administration is framing that ban, right? When we look at the Biden administration's national security strategy, he framed the administration's approach to China as an approach of responsible competition. Right. And by responsible, he meant not kicking off either a hot or a cold war as he engaged in competition with the country. However, that is not how this is being perceived in Beijing. Right. You know, Beijing's policies, its domestic policies, particularly in terms of domestic development and food security, particularly in terms of domestic development and climate change and climate technology, in terms of the digital economy, are all predicated on access to AI. And so from Beijing's perspective, right? Those bans represent not responsible competition, but an existential threat.
A stranglehold.
A stranglehold, exactly. And so, I think one of the critical risks here with these export controls is that China calibrates its response based on the perceived threat, which is existential. And so I think that's one of the factors raising the uncertainty and the factors raising the risk for the international community.
Gary, E is not an option.
So I'm going to go to F. No, I would say it's necessary and sufficient. So and it's necessary because of the number of the items you have up here. There had been intellectual property misappropriation. There was not an open market for a large amount of the volume in China. I think that the sufficient part is important because this was not a ban. And I think that that's really important to understand. This is a ban and a restriction on a very, very small percentage of the highest end semiconductor chips and technologies. It also does not prohibit the development of software for more advanced geometries. It's a combination. So actually, remarkably for the U.S., which usually uses a hammer, this is a pretty nuanced policy that I think takes some time to understand what the exact repercussions are.
Marco.
I mean, I think it's A, if I have to pick one of these four. But what's interesting to me is that there isn't anything about U.S. domestic politics on it. This clearly satisfies a condition in the U.S. that there's only two truths in American politics, which is babies are cute and China is evil. And it satisfies that part of it as well. I think there's a motivation here. I think American policymakers have decided that semiconductors are critical for the future. I'm not sure that's the truth, in fact. Ukrainian war, for example, is not being fought with anything below 40 nanometer chip, as an example. And so I'm not really sure that A is necessary, but I think it's A plus U.S. domestic politics.
Ulrika.
Yeah, I don't know whether as an investor I have enough knowledge, political acumen to decide, but what I can do is infer from the impact of the ban, the potential intention. And what I would say is that this ban, maybe contrary to what you were saying, Gary, is the Sputnik moment for China. This goes right at the heart of what Made in China 2025 was set out to do. And these are not my words. Those are the words of Xi Jinping when he toured one of the leading flash manufacturers in Wuhan, YMTC, in 2018. And he said at the time, he compared the importance of the semiconductor industry that Marco just mentioned to the importance of the human heart. And he said, it doesn't matter how big you are, if your heart isn't strong enough, you're not really strong. And so what this ban now does is impacting the Chinese domestic memory industry significantly. I mean, if you look at the economic impact, it could be easily up to $20 billion between memory and then also high-performance computing, fabless, and foundry. So I think there's a significant impact that China will experience from this ban.
So I think that there will be impact, but the thing that you have to realize, China blew up $50 billion of investment in two semiconductor groups in the last 2 years, Wuhan Semiconductor and Tsinghua Group. Those were self-inflicted wounds. So I still think the self-inflicted wounds made in China 2025 wasn't the greatest idea to publish that in 2016. And they weren't ready for this. And again, the US could have taken the annihilation approach and really hammered them. And they chose not to. That was a very conscious choice not to do that. I think China, with the corruption in semiconductor investments and the things that they're going through, I think they've set themselves back more than this particular program will set them back.
Shall we see what the audience thinks and reveal the results of our poll? There we go.
There we go. Can I actually follow on a little bit? Because I think it's actually quite interesting. We conflate the idea that advancement, that kneecapping China's semiconductor industry, the hardware industry, is actually the same as kneecapping China's AI development. Mm-hmm. I don't actually know if those two things are the same, right? I mean, if you were going to ask about the results of the export ban or the export restrictions, I would say, will it kneecap China's ability to manufacture and produce? And you're right. I think they're very narrow, actually. I think BIS, from everything I've read, went way out of its way to keep those restrictions narrow as far as they're concerned. But will it kneecap manufacturing capacity? Absolutely, no question. Everything I've heard from, companies, we've heard from companies in Beijing have said this is going to be disastrous, particularly in the case that the U.S. is able to convince allied nations like Japan, like the Netherlands, like Taiwan, like, South Korea to get on board. But does that mean that China cannot then develop better algorithms that use legacy chips? Does it mean that they cannot leverage the fact that they are one of the world's largest producers of data by volume, right? AI needs data. China is arguably way ahead of the United States on the collection of data, on government data infrastructure, on data policy. So, it's not just about the hardware, and I think those are two separate issues.
I need to jump in to say two things. The first is that we tried to pin down the Japanese economy minister, Nishimura, here on Tuesday on that very subject, and he refused to be pinned down, so that may tell you something. The second thing I think is important to talk about is this nanometer issue. I think it was you, Marco, who said nanometers. I'm guessing, and to sort of play on words, if you will, that to most people in the audience, nanometers are as good as Chinese. What are we talking about here? The export controls are very specific to your point, Gary, about what can no longer be sold to China. Logic chips based on circuit widths of 16 nanometers or less, DRAM chips of 18 nanometer half pitch or less, and NAND flash memory chips with 128 layers or more. I know a little bit about semiconductors, but most of that doesn't make any sense to me. Help us make sense of it.
Me?
You.
Well, first of all, I'm the geopolitical guy here on this panel, so the wrong person to talk to about chips. But I will say this: nanometers, schnanometers. Why? And again, look, China has pivoted away from TMT sector on its own. As Gary's saying, they've kneecapped a number of different firms in the semiconductor space and also in the TMT sector. They've already made a decision since, I think, 2020 to shift towards hard tech and focus on a German economic growth model. This is very clear. There's this emphasis on Mittelstand, on the little giants, on hardware. And I think correctly. I mean, look, what's the nanometer size of a chip that Germany produces? Oh, yeah, that's right. Germany does not produce any semiconductors. Germany does not produce smartphones. And yet, if they wanted to, within 2 years, they would be able to produce a military that would crush everything before them. I mean, if anybody has any doubts, read some history. What am I getting at? I'm getting at the fact that the United States of America has in some ways decided to make this the topic of competition, the way that Gary, Eric, and I have decided before coming here to compete on who's going to have the more ridiculous socks. Right? But it's a little bit random, in my view. Yeah, AI is going to be important in 10 years, I get it, but you know what it's not important about? Today. As I said, the war in Ukraine is being fought with weapons from the 90s. HIMARS, javelins, they weren't developed 5 years ago, they were developed decades ago. And so China's going to be fine. Not only are their policymakers focusing already on non-TMT, non-AI, they're pivoting away from the 2016 published 2025 policy. They're beyond that. They've figured out what's happening. Two, I'm not sure it's going to be critical in the true measure of geopolitical power. You can be an extremely sophisticated regional hegemon without being able to produce 5 nanometer chips or AI. Again, just ask Germany.
I know I was being a little bit unfair to you, Marco, because you're not a semiconductor expert. The closest person to being a semiconductor expert on this panel might be you, Ulrika. This is something you look at very closely. You invest in large cap technology companies. You look at Tokyo Electron. You look at Applied Materials. You know the relative strengths of each of these companies, but most importantly, you know what technological advantage it is that they have. So what, again, going back to the nanometer question, what is and what isn't included in this export control, or as some people prefer to call it, sanction?
Yeah, there are really two elements to it. One is, you mentioned, is the AI chips, and that was the first part of the ban. That mainly for U.S. company affected NVIDIA and AMD, and probably we're talking about $2.5 billion in revenue that is at stake there. And then the second part of the ban that's actually economically much more meaningful is the ban on U.S. equipment into China, into the domestic Chinese semiconductor companies. And that's where I see a real economic impact, because if you look at a company like, for instance, YMTC, that had admittedly closed or come closer to some of the NAND products from other countries like South Korea, the US, and Taiwan, for those businesses, not being able to receive US equipment and also parts and maintenance is going to be close to existential. So I think if we're sitting here a year from now, I think YMTC, and also there's another advanced foundry company, SMIC, that came out with a 7-nanometer chip-based, going back to the nanometer discussion. Those were maybe two milestones that the US looked at and said, well, this is probably more than we expected, and said, no longer can we ship this US equipment. And that's a much bigger economic hit, even for the US. So for China, it questions, the future of their memory industry, but also for the US, it has close to over $7 billion impact in terms of annual revenue for these US companies no longer being able to export.
Now, when you say this is potentially an existential problem for these would-be Chinese chip makers or equipment makers, does that mean they become unprofitable, or that revenue goes to zero, or they're out of business because they don't have access to the advanced chip-making tools they require?
Yeah, I think the revenue will be significantly impacted, and with that, obviously, operating profits as well. I mean, it's difficult to guess what they can get access to domestically, but it's going to be very small.
Can I jump in as well?
Yeah. Sorry, so just one statistic, though. 7-nanometer and lower account for 5% of chip revenues worldwide. So what we are not talking about the vast majority of the foundry chip revenue for the Chinese fabs. For U.S. equipment suppliers, there's a little more constraint, as Enrique said, but in terms of revenue from the Chinese manufacturers themselves, very, very few of them have any material exposure to anything under the 14, 16 nanometer range.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also, you raised talent was also the issue, right? I mean, there's this restriction on people as well. A couple of statistics on that point. Chinese officials have essentially said, the Chinese labor officials have essentially said that there's currently a 300,000 person shortfall in the semiconductor industry, and they're graduating 30,000 semiconductor talents a year. So even if everything remains exactly as is, you're still looking at a 10-year gap in talent in the industry, and it won't remain exactly as is. I mean, you'll see probably a spike. I think the projection is that talent needed by 2025 will hit around 600,000 people. So, the restriction on import of just human capital is also a serious problem, I think.
I do want to remind everybody that there's an iPad right here. That means you can submit questions via your phone, and there is one here that I'd like to address right now. We've heard the word existential 3 times, once from Kendra, once from Ulrike, and then I repeated it. Existential is a big word.
It's a big word.
If the Chinese do, as you say, perceive this in existential terms, how are they going to respond?
If that's the million-dollar question. The problem, in short, right now is that the only responses that China has been kicking around are also foot bullets for China. They cause as much pain to China, or a significant amount of pain to China, as they may cause to the U.S. And those include the following things that we've, again, heard discussed. There's been no decision. And I also think, just to underscore the point, that the party has not decided. I don't think a decision has been made. But we are seeing policy advisors and policymakers kick around a bunch of potential options. One of the options we've heard raised is, China does, I think, something like 90%, 80% of the world's rare earth, element processing.
This is the stuff critical to the green transition, to battery production, to electric vehicles.
Yes. And so they might restrict, export of those processed minerals to the United States. That was one option. They've kind of done it before in 2010 in a dispute with Japan, so that's why that's being raised. The other potential is to use the anti-foreign sanctions law, to use potentially the export control law, to use some kind of blocking on companies, and something that doesn't get raised but that I think is a potential response vector is data. Right? You want to talk about the two battlegrounds in geopolitical tech. Battleground number one is chips. Battleground number two is data, right? And cross-border data flows and cross-border data transfers. So China just recently released, an export control regime for data. Companies can now, it used to be that companies had to keep restricted data within China. Now there's a pathway through which they can apply to the internet regulators to get that data out. In the provisions, basically what happens is if you're exporting data from China and you get a license to do that, that license is valid for 2 years, but it gets reviewed in the case of, and this is right there in the rules, a change in the geopolitical environment between the two countries. So there's the potential that companies in China, maybe American companies based in China, trying to get their machine learning data back to their AIs in the US, could be denied access from doing that. But all of those things, anti-foreign sanctions, export controls, data blocking, rare earth exports, cause pain to China. They are still very interested in getting foreign direct investment. They want foreign companies over there. They want that investment. And so making it, zero COVID is bad enough, making it more unpalatable, more uncertain, more dangerous to do business there is also not ideal. So what we heard at the 20th Party Congress was Xi Jinping slip in a mention that he might be working on a bigger policy toolkit for dealing with these kind of sanctions and these kind of export controls. And so that's what I expect we'll see.
Ulrike.
Yeah, I just wanted to qualify existential a little bit. So this is this was directed at the Chinese domestic memory industry.
No, I realize, and I think everybody got it.
But potentially, China could also think, why don't I just change the game? Why don't I just play this game? I go to the next level of this game, which is quantum computing. Obviously, China has invested heavily, $15 billion. The U.S., relatively small amount of $2 billion in the CHIPS Act. So that could be one potential play. And I think the other thing just to realize, though, is we've talked a lot about the technological leverage that the U.S. has over China. But if you look at the economic leverage that China has over the U.S., that actually is larger just with Apple alone than the economic impact from these sanctions on China. Apple has, I think, 74 billion in revenue from China, and close to 40% of its suppliers are located in China. So there is a good economic systems of checks and balances in place that I hope will ultimately lead to a more constructive dialogue around data and AI.
The word existential, to me, is 1941, right? U.S. banned export of oil to Japan. That was existential, so they bombed Pearl Harbor. Banning export of data as a retaliation to this seems to me like falls wildly short of existential. And so what I would say is over the next 12 months, we'll see. I would bet on the side that there will be no retaliation. When they did when they went after rare earths in 2011, they actually lost the 90% edge. It went down significantly. And so I think China has learned from this. The other issue is you don't want to mess with the green tech revolution. That will anger the Europeans, who are an important wedge player for China over the next decade. And I think China will be very careful on that front. So I would take the other side, because it's fun. And I would say there will be no retaliation whatsoever because it's not existential. And because, as I said earlier, I think the Chinese policymakers have pivoted from many of their hopes and dreams of 2025. The other thing I would say is, Gary pointed out it was very targeted to a specific level of sophistication of chips. And then you mentioned, Eric, that the Japanese, of course, minister didn't want to reveal what they were going to do. The two are connected. I don't think the U.S., out of magnanimity, decided to be very specific. I think there's an unseen constraint that we as investors have to start realizing. The U.S. doesn't get to do what it wants. There are allies that are going to be very difficult to wrangle on this issue. Now, at 16 nanometer level, at AI chip level, maybe they'll play along. But if the U.S. keeps pushing the boundaries, they will start getting pushback from the Netherlands, from Japan, from South Korea, their own geopolitical allies. So maybe at this level there's unanimity. but it's going to start to fray. And actually, some great reporting by Bloomberg. There was an article 2 days ago by your team, Eric. I mean, basically, saying this. The article details all the different unnamed officials from the Netherlands, from Japan, from South Korea, complaining that this was a very unilateral extrajudicial decision by the U.S.
Yeah, I would add that, so totally agree that in terms of the geopolitical nature where this fits, also agree that this is not an existential threat to China. Again, the revenue that this impacts is actually just too small. In fact, if you look at the folks in China that are trying to replicate NVIDIA, so the people designing GPUs, they're all using an ARM core. There's not a single native core in China that's received enough financing to get to tape out of the chips. So that means you're by definition 5, 7, 8 years behind in terms of what the core needs to be to even build your own graphics processor unit. So if China pushes back, the next pushback is, no, you don't get access to any of this. And then you get into some more existential level type of conversations. One thing, if I change this though to EVs, because that's an area where the West is really going to get its ass kicked. When you look at right now, 60% of exports are Chinese firms. 60%, or I mean, 60% of the exports are Chinese EVs of Chinese native brands. You really have to think hard what that means. These are $10,000, $15,000 cars. Automobile industry always drives middle-class economics in almost every place it goes. This is a big deal. There is nothing in the United States, nothing to compete with what China's going to be able to do at the entry level of the EV market. And those dollars are going to matter a great deal.
Well, let me respond a little bit there because my thesis has been called into question. I actually don't disagree with you in the sense that I don't think this is an existential threat to China necessarily, but I think it'll certainly be perceived as an existential threat to chip industry. But when I say existential, let me give you an example of what I mean and what is not being discussed in D.C. by U.S. policymakers in relation to this. So China's facing an aging population crisis right now. As I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, by the year 2040, something like 35% of the population is going to be over the age of 65, right? And the average age of the Chinese farmer, I think 60% of Chinese farmers are over the age of 45. And you have very few youth coming into the profession, right? So what you're basically dealing with is a situation where in the next 20 years, you're going to have a huge percentage of the farming population age out. And China doesn't really have an immigration policy to speak of to replace those workers. So what a lot of the agricultural policies say, and what a lot of the agricultural smart tech policies say is, we need AI to make our agriculture more efficient. We need to be, able to predict weather patterns. We need to be able to generate smart seeds, right, and drought-resistant seeds and all this kind of stuff. When you take away the ability to do that or reduce the ability to do that, I think that kind of issue is much broader than military use, right? Semiconductors are not just a military technology, as we know. Many of the applications are consumer-facing and have to do with food security and have to do with the climate crisis. So when you have the Biden administration say something like, hey, look, we want to work with you on climate, we want to work with you on food security, but, we want to compete with you robustly on AI, that comes across as disingenuous, and this is the reason why.
Ulrike, I want to tap into your knowledge for just a second here, because what Kendra is talking about and what Xi Jinping referenced in his address to the Chinese Communist Party Congress necessitates that if China wants to catch up to the West, let's call it, the US-based semiconductor technology, it's going to have to make some huge advances. Why is chip making so devilishly hard to master, and can China catch up?
Yeah, maybe just one quick point to what Kendra was saying, because I think it's a really important question. I feel like we need probably something like a nuclear, the equivalent of a nuclear non-proliferation agreement for right. AI.
Yeah,
we're saying, this is an AI confinement treaty here. We want to work together for civilian purposes and to solve these really important global issues that have all been discussed here at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. But now to your question, why is it so hard? If you want to compete in the leading edge of chips, you need what's called EUV lithography. And what that is a very, what EUV does is using tiny wavelengths of lights to imprint patterns on chips through a very complex system of mirrors. And there's really only one company in the world that has succeeded in doing that, which is ASML in the Netherlands. And it's taken them 35 years of research. The machines have over 100,000 parts that are sourced from 4,700 suppliers, with many of whom ASML has very tight, exclusive relationships very often. And the precision is such, Eric, that of the optical precision is such that if you were thinking that there's an astronaut on the moon now shooting a laser, it would precisely hit my fingertip. So in order to get to that level of engineering ingenuity, you need to lever the best of talent, the best of materials and processes globally. And I think that's very hard to do within the confines of autarky.
I've heard various views on this, but they sort of fall into three camps, that it'll take 10 years, 20 years, and possibly never for China to catch up. Do we have a view on that?
I would have said that before these sanctions, they were in the 7 to 10 range. But again, not across the board. There are 11 steps in semiconductor manufacturing. The Chinese are actually at world class in two. One is around the end and the packaging side. And that actually is why Intel got out of the semiconductor business back in the 80s, that its packaging technology was so poor that the Japanese just destroyed them on a cost basis. So Intel gave up memory and they focused on microprocessors. That's kind of what the entire U.S. industry has wound up doing, is moving up the food chain. So I would look at this as the actions that have been taken are a two-generation type of action, meaning if you think that these things are 5-year cycles for semiconductor technology moving from one set of nanometer technologies to another, then I think it is about a 10-year period of time.
Nodding, everybody? Difference of opinion?
I mean, it's just really hard to see a path forward because the hardware is so, the hardware path has been closed, right? And it took, my understanding is it took ASML 25 years to develop those machines. China's not there yet, and if they can't get the components to even begin, that's a question. What that leads to is whether or not China can develop software that allows AI to run on older technology, on lesser chips. Yeah.
Marco, you mentioned earlier that taking a tough stance on China is politically popular in the United States. It is one of the precious few issues on which Republicans and Democrats generally agree. But in the world of business and finance, there is no such unanimity. You may recall, folks, that Ken Griffin was up here on stage a couple of days ago. He's the founder and CEO of Citadel, hedge fund and market-making firm. And he said that a policy of cutting China off from advanced technology will be disastrous economically and geopolitically for the United States. He said that it would inspire President Xi to undertake the chip equivalent of the Manhattan Project, to pour all the scientific and advanced computing resources that China has, the millions of STEM graduates that it churns out every year, into solving this problem. And he thought it might take 3 to 7 years. And if China were successful, that it would bifurcate the global tech stack, and the United States and its allies would supply equipment to themselves effectively, and China would supply Latin America and Africa and possibly India, in other words, the fastest growing and fastest developing and most economically attractive parts of the world.
What I would just say is that linear extrapolation never works in forecasting. And Kendra's point is very interesting to me. I didn't think of this, but they have slower chips. Maybe their software will have to get better. They'll do more with less. Look, industrial revolutions started in England. Why? Because they ran out of wood. The rest of the world was looking at England saying, like, oh, look at you, haha, you're going to have to get dirty with coal. That's really terrible because you have to go find it, it's heavy, dig it. We go outside of our house, cut a tree, we got energy. But that insufficiency, that lack of something led to the United Kingdom, well, England at the time, developing canals, steam engine, boom, industrial revolution. So I think that, linear extrapolation is very difficult, and we may all say 10 years, 20 years. I have no idea. I don't know what the years is. Maybe it's never. China will never develop advanced semiconductors, and so what? They can invent fusion. You know, if the Chinese invent fusion, if they've discovered it before us, we're all speaking Mandarin in 20 years. So I'm just saying, I think that we're overly focused on semiconductors as if having advanced semiconductors makes you a world power. Again, I have to bring up Germany yet again for the 15th time. Germany cannot produce a single advanced semiconductor, and it can still invade you and win. So I think that it's a misplaced focus in some way. I think we're overly obsessed with advanced semiconductors.
For better or for worse, I'm going to remain obsessed for our last two questions. I want to finish off by busting a couple of myths. And we'll begin with this one. That all China needs to do to catch the West in chip technology is invade Taiwan. Who wants to take that one on?
I mean, that's
Gary.
ridiculous. Yeah, go ahead, Gary. That's my take.
Well, the Taiwanese government has even come out and said, TSMC has come out and said that, you know, China invades Taiwan. 60% of senior TSMC executives are Americans, so they're gone. All the people maintaining every piece of advanced equipment in Taiwan are foreigners. They're gone. So you wind up with a bunch of very, very beautiful, expensive equipment that no one knows how to run.
And we should add, and maybe explain, TSMC is the premier semiconductor manufacturer in the world, has mastered the sophisticated processes, Ulrike, that you were describing better than any other company on the planet. And on which so many producers, including Apple, are totally relying.
This is like, you know, that logic reminds me of like medieval Europe. You know, you take my castle, I take yours. It doesn't work like that. I mean, it's more complicated than this. Like, semiconductors don't grow on trees in a particular Taiwanese climate.
Yeah, and particularly to that point, I think, you know, for anybody in the room who hasn't heard this, TSMC has been called Taiwan's silicon shield. The idea being that if, you know, China invades Taiwan, the potential is that TSMC gets blown up and, you know, China won't be able to make chips anymore. I haven't heard any U.S. policymakers address the fact that if they do succeed in completely locking China out of the chip industry, and there is no reason anymore to manufacture chips in Taiwan, does that not remove the silicon shield? And so I think that's something we need to hear more discussion about.
An important point. And this is the second myth I want to bust to finish off, that it's just as easy for America to wean itself off of dependence on Taiwan and South Korea now that the Biden administration has passed the CHIPS Act and earmarked $53 billion in subsidies for chip making. Fabs are just going to spring up all over America and be just as good as TSMC and Samsung.
I mean, I can't get a cup of coffee in America because there's not enough people working in coffee shops. And we're supposed to build all these fabs, and all these sophisticated engineers are going to show up out of where? You know, so like there's a labor shortage in the U.S. I mean, if you look at people working in semiconductors, it's collapsed since the 90s in the United States. So, like, good luck with the CHIPS Act. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, it's going to take time. I think the plans right now are for TSMC to obviously increase their founder business in the U.S., but even if you look at the plans for the end of this year, early next year, it's not even 5% of the overall TSMC capacity in Taiwan. So we're talking about a long period of time for self-sufficiency.
Yeah, I was working with Philip Wong on the U.S. Semiconductor Working Group that led to parts of the CHIP Act. And the thing that he said that really struck me, I'd never heard anyone say this before, is the U.S. idea is that you build the facility, those people go away, you install the equipment, those people go away, and then you have people come in, the engineers to run the fab. He goes, that's not what TSMC does. The people that put the plumbing in place, the people that poured the concrete, the people that put up the sheetrock, they stay with that fab for a decade. They said when you're looking at 3-nanometer lower technology, these really cutting-edge technologies, that entire team needs to be in place for a decade. So it is just totally orthogonal to how Americans have thought about building fabs. So if we want to be in that business, we're going to have to fundamentally change. And the shortage won't be engineers. The shortage will be the plumbers in Ohio to build the damn pipes.
So maybe the American plan is for China to invade Taiwan, and then the Taiwanese move to America.
I may be overly obsessed with semiconductors, but for better or for worse, ladies and gentlemen, these are the geopolitics of technology. Please join me in thanking my panelists.
Thanks.
Please welcome to the stage Chief Economist of Bloomberg Economics, Tom Orlick.
So, what did everyone think of that Boris Johnson speech last night? Pretty hilarious, right? It's that quality of leadership which is going to have me and the other British people chuckling through the looming recession and the multi-decade drag on growth from Brexit. Hilarious. So, on to my presentation, which I've titled High Rates, Broken China, and the Return of History. It's a lot, right? But, you know, it's Thursday afternoon. I figure go big or go home, or perhaps go big and then go home. So, in the early 1980s, Paul Volcker, the Fed chair, slayed the dragon of inflation. And in the period since then, and especially in the period since the global financial crisis, inflation has stayed low, and that has enabled central banks to keep borrowing costs low. That has now changed. In the last 2 years, inflation has rocketed up, and as you can see in this chart, that has pushed global central banks, the Fed, the ECB, and the Bank of England onto an accelerated tightening trajectory. That shift from a world of cheap money to a world of expensive money is going to have profound impacts on the global economy. In a world of cheap money, the G7 can pile on public debt and service it at very low cost. In a world of expensive money, as you can see in this chart, debt in G7 economies has moved onto an unsustainable trajectory. In a world of cheap money, emerging and frontier economies can borrow to pay for crucial imports of food and fuel and service those debts at low cost. In a world of expensive money, they can't. Some, like Sri Lanka, have already defaulted, and it's only action by the International Monetary Fund everywhere from Pakistan to Argentina which is preventing a larger wave of emerging market defaults and market meltdowns. In a world of cheap money, Sam Bankman-Fried is a genius, and Mark Zuckerberg is building the metaverse. In a world of expensive money, Sam Bankman-Fried is bankrupt, and Mark Zuckerberg is saying goodbye to thousands of his employees. Put simply, in a world of cheap money, everything is easy. In a world of expensive money, everything is difficult, and we are now in a world of expensive money. There's another important transition which is taking place in the global economy. A shift from supercharged China growth to slumping China growth. Now, I think we have to acknowledge that on China, the last few days have brought some unexpected good news. COVID-0 restrictions are being eased a little sooner than expected. Property stimulus is a little more generous than expected. And US-China relations have gone from deep freeze to warm handshakes. The immediate outlook for China growth, the outlook for 2023, is a little brighter than it appeared a few days ago. Even so, when we look to the medium term, China faces some enormous challenges. Demographics have turned from a driver to a drag, with the working age population shrinking. Overcapacity in industry and in real estate, and the debt which has been taken on to pay for the build-out of that overcapacity will be a drag on growth, not just in 2022 and 2023, but for years ahead. And Xi Jinping's decision to stay on as General Secretary of the Communist Party and China's paramount leader for a precedent-breaking third term, and to stack the Standing Committee with his allies, raises new questions about China's governance. Will the quality of decision-making on China's economy be as good in the years ahead as it was in the years past? Put these problems together, and a Chinese economy which for much of the last 4 decades recorded annual growth of around 10%, will in the 2020s be lucky if it records average annual growth of 4%. By the end of this decade, some economists say China will be growing at just a 2% pace. For the rest of the world, the difference between a China growing at 10% a year and a China growing at 2% a year is profound. Why has Singapore outperformed in recent years? Well, one reason for that, of course, is the smarts and ingenuity of the Singaporean government and the Singaporean people, qualities that we've seen on abundant display once again at this year's New Economy Forum. But another reason is because Singapore, like other Asian economies, has been swept along by the rising tide of Chinese demand. And as China's growth now decelerates, that driver is going to turn into a drag. As you can see in this chart, every 1 percentage point deceleration in China's growth subtracts 0.5% from Singapore's growth. And the same is true of Indonesia, the same is true of Thailand, the same is true of Malaysia and the Philippines. For the commodity exporters, new economies like Brazil and Chile and Peru, which have mined and drilled to extract the raw materials needed to feed China's industrial engine. The transition from rapid growth in China to substantially slower growth in China is going to mean lower commodity prices, reduced export earnings, and so slower growth. In the decades just past, China has been a driver of rapid global growth. In the decade to come, that driver is set to turn into a drag. On geopolitics, in 1989, the political scientist Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history with the final triumph of democracy and free markets over state-controlled economies and authoritarian political systems. As the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, Fukuyama looked prescient. But with the benefit of 3 decades of hindsight, we can now see that his call was, well, let's just call it premature. In the decades since the fall of the Soviet Union, the share of global GDP coming from the free market democratic West hasn't risen, it's fallen. And the share coming from Asia has increased substantially. Now, clearly the relationship is not one for one. There are vibrant democracies and free markets here in Asia. But in broad strokes, the transition, the rebalancing of global GDP from the West to the East is also the fall of free market democracies and the rise of some authoritarian and state-dominated systems. And that return of history, too, has profound consequences for the global economy. What did Vladimir Putin say to Xi Jinping when the two men stood together in January, just days before the Russian tanks rolled across the border into Ukraine? Perhaps we'll never know, but I think it's a reasonable bet that it's the decline of the free market democratic West that was one of the factors which emboldened Putin. Now, the consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine primarily are a tragedy for the Ukrainian people, but they also send shockwaves across the global economy. Look at the outlook for Europe's GDP with supplies of Russian gas cut off. If winter is warm and gas reserves hold up, Europe can continue to grow. If winter is cold and Europe runs out of gas, Europe faces a recession as deep as that which followed the global financial crisis. On US-China relations, the temperature is a few degrees warmer following Xi and Biden's meeting in Bali, but it's still pretty chilly. Trump tariffs remain in place, and the Biden administration has gone further, imposing a ban on sales of leading-edge semiconductors to China, which, if strictly enforced, threatens to turn China into a kind of Amish community, its technological development frozen in place. A world where history is over is a world of free trade between great powers, cheap goods, abundant energy, strong growth, and low inflation. A world where history has returned is a world of new barriers to trade between great powers, snarled supply chains, scarce energy, fragile growth, and volatile prices. Now, I don't want to leave you with too gloomy a picture, although I'm not sure I've succeeded in that objective. There are things that can go right as well as go wrong. Perhaps China will exit COVID-0 more quickly than expected. Perhaps US inflation will come down more quickly than expected, and the Federal Reserve will be able to get away with a lower terminal rate. Perhaps global condemnation of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine will bring that conflict to an end sooner than expected. There are risks to the upside as well as to the downside. The big picture I want to leave you with, though, is that three pillars which supported decades of rising global prosperity, low global borrowing costs, supercharged demand from China, and limited geopolitical frictions, those pillars have all been kicked away. As a consequence, seldom has the outlook for the global economy been more fraught with uncertainty and peril, and seldom has the need for the solutions which are being discussed at this year's New Economy Forum been more urgent. Thank you.
Please welcome our panellists. First Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Geeta Gopinath. Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Algebris Investments, Davide Serra. Chairman of the Institute for International Finance, Axel Weber. And our moderator, Head of Economics and Government of Bloomberg Editorial and Research, Stephanie Flanders.
Well, Tom has set us up nicely there. When inflation's the topic, the end of easy money, it would be very easy to spend the next half an hour raking over who made the biggest mistakes and why. We're not going to do that. We've already spent months doing that. We're going to think about where we are and what are the consequences for all of us, but particularly policymakers. Is this an inflationary episode or a new inflationary or potentially inflationary era? And if so, how does our macro policy toolkit, developed for the different kind of times that Tom just described, how does that toolkit need to change? And we have a range of different perspectives on that. But I'm going to start with you, Geeta, first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. We know inflation hits the poorest, hardest. Collectively, are policymakers now doing enough to confront this? I mean, and what are the risks that you see?
Firstly, it's a real pleasure to be here and to join this panel. I mean, Stephanie, without a doubt, one of the biggest challenges economies around the world are facing is inflation, and to bring inflation down at a time when growth is also slowing for other reasons because of other forms of supply shocks. I think what central banks around the world have clearly recognized is that they need to move in a determined fashion to durably bring inflation down. And after a period of substantial rate increases, I mean, if you see the total amount of rate increases that we've seen in the US this past year, there are few parallels in terms of the last several decades to see this much of an increase in such a short period of time. But that was needed to address the kind of inflation that we haven't seen in over 4 decades. So I think they're at a point where the US Fed is at a point where they've raised interest rates around 375 basis points. They are very likely to raise interest rates another round before the end of this year. And then the question is what comes next? And I think for 2023, the question is more about how long are you going to keep these rates at the levels that they've moved them to. And we see a need to keep it at over 4% for all of 2023 to be able to bring inflation down durably. And like you said, it's very important to do that because it's extremely regressive, high levels of inflation. Now, there are countries at other different points in their cycle, but I focused on the US because in terms of spillovers to the rest of the world, US policies have the biggest effect.
Axel, you're the former central banker on this panel, and we should record that you were on the record early in warning about inflation at the end of 2020. But you have now had at least 90 central banks raise interest rates this year, at least half of them more than 75 basis points in a single go, which most of them had not done before. Are we now at a point where central banks can have a more leisurely, we're not talking pivots, but a more leisurely pace?
No, I think, as Geeta was indicating, as a central banker, 75 basis point moves are usually conducted over the last couple of decades only on the way down when you have been hit by a shock. And you were behind the curve by construction because something unexpected hit the economy, like in the financial crisis. On the way up, I think it's a mirror image, and again, we don't want to talk about the past, but it's a bit of a mirror image of being late, in my view, by design from the inflation targeting regime that was adopted, and therefore having to do faster steps because inflation didn't just rise from below 2% to just above 2% or 3% or 4%, went all the way up to double digit. And that's where I think a lot of action was needed. If central banks have a dual mandate, which many of them have explicitly or implicitly, the most violated objective in the central bank objective function at the moment is inflation. It's way out of line with the target, whilst the employment and the economy has been holding up relatively well so far. And there is a new shock with the war in Ukraine that has added another negative supply shock to an already strained environment that central banks were facing. So I don't think they're done. I think they got some more work to do. I think the belief in markets that central banks will go up and then come back in next year is, in my view, both premature and not ideal from a central bank point of view. And with Geeta, they probably have to keep rates at which they go over the spring next year at that level for the remainder of the year and into 24 to bring inflation down towards their objective. And it'll take them 2 years to really be in the vicinity again of their objective, bearing further shocks. But bearing further shocks, as we just saw, is a very brave assumption. And a lot of the things that are in the pipeline, the transition to a greener economy, all of this will have inflationary impacts on energy prices and on other parts of life. So I think there is a likely scenario where you will see repeated shocks that will keep inflation high and more persistently high, despite central banks having adjusted monetary policy and having raised rates substantially, at least for the next year or two.
And as we know, it's been discussed this week, it's not just the move to net zero, it's climate change itself also produces more volatile inflation. I think we're pretty clear on that. Davide, from the investor standpoint, where do you think we are on this road?
I think a couple of numbers. The first one, if only in the last 50 years we have calculated, had the world priced carbon emission efficiently, today a bottle of $1 will be $1.50. So first of all, I think we have, in a way, a pay-to-price for what we haven't priced for 50 years. This, in my view, was not captured. Secondly, investors right now have this view, at least what's priced in the future, the rates are going to go lower. But here, the beauty of Bank of England, that has calculated numbers for the last 5 centuries, is never in developed markets, when core inflation passes 5% for more than 12 months, they've been able to bring the core inflation number below 2 in less than 10 years. In some time, it took 30 years, only once in history, in the last century, in less than 5 years. So if history is of any help, I think rates here are going to stay higher for longer. And there are 3 reasons for it. The inflation shock comes from 3 main areas. The first one is green transition. The second is the decoupling of the supply chain globally for geopolitical reasons. And third, remember, green transition requires materials which are no longer in an abundant space. You know, think about copper. We've been looking for copper for 2,000 years. We need to find more copper in the next 20 years than we've been finding in the last 2,000 years. Yeah? All right. And when you add then the adverse consequences of green transition and climate change on food, you add minerals, and then you add the war, you're creating an effect. That's why I think inflation is going to be structurally slightly higher. Then, if you think that we had in developed market, US and Europe, 25% of fiscal stimulus in 2020-21. And 2020 was needed because of COVID. 2021, honestly, was a bit of a giveaway. And hence, that's positive for the simple reason that now people have better balance sheet. You see it in the US. So recession is likely to be less, shallow. We're not going to be a hard recession. And as a result, I think central bank can keep rates higher. So I think if the market is wrong, rates ain't going to go down as fast as people think.
Does the IMF buy into the, because Davide, in a sense, is running together both things. There's the current inflation shock that people are dealing with, and then these longer-term trends. And people have thought that maybe this was a sneak preview to those, but he's kind of saying we're already there. Do you buy into that we're already in this structurally higher inflation world?
Not fully. I would say the following, which is what is true is we are likely entering a period where supply shocks will play a bigger role than they did in the last 2 decades. And supply shocks include shocks that come from climate, but also I think risks in terms of economic fragmentation around the world, what could happen to global trade. I think those risks play and could play an important role. So we probably are entering an era where for central banks, they really have a trade-off to deal with. They didn't have a trade-off. It was for the last couple of decades, they could keep reducing the unemployment rate and not see any inflation. They didn't really have a trade-off to deal with, but now they actually are likely to have a more serious trade-off to deal with. But to the question of the inflation that we're seeing now, I would not start with the green transition or climate as being the leading factor for it. I think what we had was a very unique period, the pandemic, now the war, and we've seen very extraordinary recoveries that have come along with very large amounts of support that was provided during the worst time of the pandemic in terms of both monetary policy support and also especially fiscal policy support. So people with high levels of savings, and now you're seeing that money being spent alongside, you do have a supply side problem too, which is that in markets like the US and the UK, labor supply hasn't come back to what it was pre-pandemic. You still have the pandemic hitting other parts of the world. In China, we're seeing cases going up. That's affecting supply chains. So I think those are the main factors. I still do believe monetary policy works in the traditional way of reducing demand by raising interest rates, and we are seeing that happen in the US and in other countries. It's going to take some time. I don't think it's going to take many decades, like David has said. But again, so I would make that distinction, I mean, about what we're trying to solve now and what the risks are that are on the horizon.
I mean, Axel, this is supposed to be about, we're focusing on policy making. Mm-hmm. Clearly we've seen, I mean, the UK had some of its own problems, but there was a structural issue which many countries face of balancing now in this more challenging world, the fiscal and the monetary. Do you think we have the right sense of how fiscal and monetary needs to work together or not work together in this environment?
Yeah, so two things, and I think David alluded to it. One thing you have to see is that what happened after COVID, namely a massive expansion of balance sheets of governments, financed largely by emissions and purchases of sovereign debt into the balance sheet of a central bank, was a coordinated extension of balance sheets on the sides of the central bank, roughly to the tune of 25% of global GDP, and of governments, and a lot of that, unlike in the financial crisis, was going to private households in forms of paychecks and really increased demand. So there was quite a demand stimulus that we saw, necessary so in 2020, but it was kept in place, at least from the monetary side, way too long, and I think that is part why we saw inflation. The other side we haven't talked about is the balance sheets, really what will happen with them in the future. Now, if you look at the S&P 500 and you look at the, added balance sheet of the major three central banks, Europe, Japan, and the US, you see a very high correlation between how financial markets have been performing and the liquidity put into the system by the central banks. Now, going forward, central banks don't just raise rates. They're also reducing their balance sheet. And actually, if you look at Europe, because some of the liquidity was provided through long-term financing operations that have an end date and not being prolonged, a lot of this excess liquidity will go relatively fast in the short period of early next year, and then the reduction of balance sheet will add to a downdraft that will continue to draw liquidity structurally out of the markets, and so the price for liquidity and the price for investments will, in my view, in the future be quite a bit higher. Not just because interest rates have risen, so the price for liquidity has gone up, but also the amount of liquidity available is going to be much lower than we've seen in the past. And what you saw in the UK was actually because of a financial stability concern, the central bank that was actually on course for reducing its balance sheet had to intervene in the market and pump liquidity in for 3 days, as Andrew Bailey announced at the IMF meeting in Washington, D.C., in order to stabilize some of the sort of strategies of UK pension funds that use derivative instruments and therefore got an exposure to strong movements in financial markets. So I wouldn't be surprised if we have further episodes in the market where that combined rate increase and withdrawal of liquidity will lead to pocket of weaknesses in financial markets because of leverage strategies getting called and not being able to be continued as they are.
I mean, how dangerous is it to have quantitative tightening, the shrinking of central bank balance sheets continue? Because after that period, the Bank of England did go forward with its policy, and we had traditionally said it was a tool, even when the balance sheet was going up, when it was going down, it was a tool that was less well understood than the impact of interest rates. So is it dangerous for central banks to keep ploughing ahead?
I think it's dangerous if they don't understand where the leverage is. So let's think about the UK.
Okay, do they?
Yes, well, that's the question. 7% current account deficit compared to +1 in Europe and +1 in the States, and 7% fiscal deficit. So when I was a young kid, I was told you had to add the two. That's 14% twin deficit. No other G20 country has it. So at the time where they eased fiscally rather than tightening, then they discovered that some of these UK pension plan had 7 times gearing, 7 times. We, as a regulated asset manager, cannot have even 0.1 times leverage. We need to have cash at any point in time. So I think the central bank here and the regulator didn't quite understood what LDI was and how geared the pension system was. Secondly, this are having, in my view, a ripple effect then on 3 items. The first and the most important, the housing market. We talk about stocks and bonds, but they are 1 times global GDP. Real estate is 4 to 5 times global GDP. So as soon as house prices starts coming off, people balance sheets are becoming weaker. You'll see it in the UK. Mortgages, max 3 years duration, they're going to reset from 1 to 5 to 6%. Well, that's an increase. And as a result, I think central banks will not be able to go immediately in quantitative tightening at the time at which they're rising, exactly for Axel point. Because if then you're going to put a premium on liquidity, then you're going to create the situation that you had in the UK. For 2 weeks, no one could get a mortgage. Mortgage offer being redrawn. That's the price of liquidity. And so I think we will probably see central bank keeping the assets they have. By the way, for 10 years, we haven't seen inflation. So the world is designed to have inflation around 2 to 3. We had 0 for 10 years. It's great that we're going to have 3, 4 for the next 10. It's just simply that, when you do an average over 20 years, probably the number is going to end up being about right. Yep. And hence, we need some inflation because the only way to deflate debt to GDP is through inflation. That's always happened in history.
Gita, one of the places you look to think about hidden financial stability risks is the IMF's Global Financial Stability Report. Do you agree that there are potentially some sort of unexploded consequences out there for quantitative tightening in central bank balance sheets?
Well, I think without a doubt, there are significant segments of the financial market that live in the shadows, that are not well regulated. We call them non-bank financial institutions. And that is where we are likely to be surprised. And that's what happened in the UK. So as our Global Financial Stability Report showed, that when you do a global stress test for the banking system, advanced economy banks are quite resilient to some very serious downside scenarios. Emerging market banks, less so. So in a very severe downside scenario, which is in the GFSR, we have about 30% of emerging markets who breach minimum capital requirements. So that's a pretty serious event. But I think the real unknown is the non-bank financial system. And that's exactly where we have hidden leverage, where we have, dark corners, which come up only when things get really difficult, like we saw in the UK. So that's something that we are worried about. More generally, in terms of the financial conditions at the moment, we see a distinction between, investment-grade assets, which everywhere around the world, but the spreads are quite low. You haven't seen much movement there. But if you look at frontier markets, that's where you're seeing a lot of stress already. We have about 60% of low-income countries that are already in high debt distress, and about 25% of emerging markets. Now, that does not make a systemic debt crisis, for sure. But again, we're in very risky times. Like the war is not over, the pandemic is not over, and we haven't won the fight against inflation. So interest rates may need to go up much more than any of us would like it to, and we have to see what happens then.
And I'm interested in this policy mix, and particularly, the UK does have its own problems. It also potentially has the financial wherewithal and the history to overcome those appalling statistics that David is. But Argentina is another country that potentially faces a fiscal monetary tension in the current environment. It's got a lot of debt, a lot of it borrowed from the IMF. It has some of the highest inflation rates in South America. What's your advice to them about how to balance those two?
No, in Argentina, there is no tension between what fiscal policy and monetary policy need to do. They all have to move in the exact same direction, which is they have to be on the restrictive side. That's part of the IMF program, which working with the authorities that was agreed on, which is, what Argentina.
But if it tanks the economy, then that.
Sorry?
If it tanks the economy, then that doesn't support.
So there's one way that we know how to bring inflation down, which requires reducing demand in the economy. The Argentina economy is growing at a healthy rate. There are headwinds to it at this moment, also from external shocks. But, having inflation now is over 70%. And if we want to have durable growth, we know that you need to bring inflation down. So just to make a point to what Davide said, which is inflation helps with debt to GDP, clearly not the case. On a long-term basis, Argentina, for instance, is an example where once you live in a high inflation environment, that gets priced into your interest rates, and then there's no gain at all in having that kind of inflation. So yes, you have a very short-term benefits because there's surprise inflation, and you've borrowed at low rates, and you have surprise inflation, so you can bring that to GDP down. But from the experience we know, that is not a durable way to bring that to GDP down.
In Argentina, if I may, Argentina is an outlier here. If you look at actually what Gita's job would have been in any of the previous cycles, you would have not seen the stability of many of the emerging markets that front-loaded some of the interest rate increases before the established central banks did in order to prevent outflows from their markets into the US and other markets. So in a way, Argentina is a special case. It only came back in the market and in being able to load up international debt not so long ago. It was in default for a long period of time, and it's a special case. But emerging markets have been amazingly resilient so far. But the problem is frontier markets, the weakest and poorest economies, because they're facing massive distress. There is a likely rating cycle that is going to set in, where even those that are just about investment grade might get downgrades to sub-investment grade. And many of the markets we talk about don't even have an investment grade. So they're not in the typical bank portfolios or fund portfolios, but still the stress from rising interest rates on these markets, which are the poorest economies of this world, is going to be massive. And that's where, at this late interest rate cycle, because inflation tends to be global. It doesn't just stick to one country or to one region. It tends to be pretty global through commodity prices and through oil and others. And that's where these countries are hit at a very important point in time in a very negative way.
Davide, are we going to be talking much more about sovereign debt in developed and developing economies next year, having spent the last year really focused on monetary policy?
Not in developed market, because I think we've seen in the UK.
Not in the Eurozone?
No, because I think there's one advantage, currency. Remember, the currency market is adjusting fast. You have seen it in Europe. We're paying 5 to 6% for hydrocarbon, gas and oil more compared to the United States, and immediately the currency is adjusted. In the UK, the pound is adjusted fast over the last 20, 30 years in the gap in productivity. I think in emerging markets, then there's a distinction. Those that are food producers are in a good shape. The issue here with the war is those that don't have enough food, and we need to import food. So sub-Saharan Africa, Egypt, we've seen in Sri Lanka. So if they have a problem in the food supply chain with rising rates and high level of debt, it might end up being an absolute catastrophe. And so I think here, actually, where we need to be all worried, even from a social perspective. Financial markets, I think the adjustments in fixed income has mainly happened because, when we're pricing 5% US rates and 3% in Europe, they're not going to go out of control. We also think the inflation short-term has kind of peaked. Why? Every industry has restocked up, and so we're long inventory. A simple data point, when Apple has ever given a discount to consumer, well, it's giving discount now for selling the MacBook PC. So you have an evidence, and at the same time, the labor market is cooling off. We have seen, every corporation is doing the classical 5 to 10% adjustment on labor force. I've not spoken to a single CEO, single entrepreneur, that is not tightening by 5 to 10% the belt across industry.
Well, I think Davide just alluded to something very important. We're starting to see the first round effects of inflation come off. And why central banks have to keep at it is to prevent second-round inflationary effects, and from this to become embedded in the wage price mechanism of the economy. Because once people start believing they should index their contracts to 4 or 5% inflation as opposed to 2, that's where it becomes very long-lasting and embedded in the economy. And that's why in the 70s it was so hard to get rid of inflation, because it had become embedded in the economy. We still have the chance to prevent that, but it requires determined action that markets and market participants will see inflation is going to come down over a reasonable period of time, not a decade. I would say 2 years, 3 years at the most, and that helps you anchor inflation expectations. They've not run away, so we're not yet lost this inflation battle, but I think we need to be really focused on that now for the period to come, at least for the next couple of months.
Gita, just a quick response to that. So, I mean, do you agree that we've dealt with the first round, but we still need to be very cautious about second round effects? But I think also what Davide said, because we've had warnings from the European Central Bank just in the last couple of days. Do you agree that there's not likely to be any issues around sovereign debt in the Eurozone in the next year or two?
So agree with Axel on the fact that it is very important for central banks to stay the course. We've had false dawns before. One in good inflation reading does not make a trend. And we have enough lessons from history of central banks who have kind of changed course too quickly, and then created an even bigger problem that required grinding the economy to a halt and even deeper recessions than would have happened if they had just stayed the course. So I think that's absolutely right, and we are there at this point that these central banks should stay the course. In terms of sovereign debt issues in the euro area. Firstly, I think that there have been a lot of important developments in the European Union, in the euro area, compared to the GFC. You have the European Stability Mechanism that is there to help countries deal with surprise events or sudden tightening in market liquidity. The ECB has put in place a transmission protection mechanism, which will help them raise interest rates, but ensure that you don't have very disorderly market conditions in certain sovereign debt markets. So I think that they have more instruments in place, better mechanisms in place to protect themselves this time around.
But there's still question marks about Italy, or do you think we're on a path now where Italy will be able to sustain the kind of increase in borrowing costs we've seen?
I think we're in a time when there is a lot of uncertainty. So, like I said, the war is not over. We haven't seen the end of the energy crisis. This winter is turning out to be warmer, and that really helps. But the bigger problem is next winter. So all of that means that the ability to raise resources to repay your debt, those challenges will remain. At the same time, I do think that there's been an improvement in policymaking, and there's been an improvement in institutions that should help safeguard against worse outcomes.
Gita Kopinas, Davide Serra, Axel Weber, thank you so much.
Thank you.
please welcome to the stage the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance for the Republic of Singapore, Lawrence Wong, and Editor-in-Chief of Bloomberg Editorial and Research, John Micklethwaite.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much for talking to us again.
Thank you, John.
I should explain to people who are not Singaporeans that you're here in two capacities. One is a member of the current government, Deputy Prime Minister, as we said, and second is the anointed successor to Prime Minister Lee, and thus the expected next Prime Minister, assuming that the People's Action Party somehow manages to win the next election.
Indeed. We don't take that for granted.
Yes, it's seemed to work quite well since 1959. I asked Henry Kissinger on this stage which Lee Kuan Yew, who began that process, which Lee Kuan Yew would be more worried about out of Russia, Ukraine, or US-China, and he said definitively US-China. And I wondered where you...
I'm not surprised at all.
Do you think anything has changed on that because of you come back from Bali, because of what Xi meeting Biden?
Well, it's very good that the leaders had an important and constructive meeting on Monday, but this is really just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. So we shouldn't have any illusions that this one meeting will change things overnight, because there has been such deep suspicions and distrust built up over so many years. And as the saying goes, trust is built in drops but lost in buckets. So now begins the long journey of building trust step by step and recognizing that there are still major differences between both sides, making sure that neither party takes any actions that will cause trust to be eroded very quickly. But for now, it's a good start.
And do you think, is there a logical next place for that to go? I mean, they talk about discussing things like climate change. Those are sort of the easy subjects in some ways.
But don't trivialize them, because I think these practical areas for cooperation are indeed important steps to building trust, as are the next steps of opening more channels of communication, which is happening, which is a very good thing, because you need that level of communication beyond the personal relationship at the very top. You need more channels of communication for trust to be built. And importantly, through these actions and interactions, hopefully, the development of some guiding principles or guardrails, so that both sides understand where the other's red lines are, what are some of the difficult issues, and they will have some basis to manage this very important relationship for the coming years.
Do you still see, you talked earlier about it's US and China sleepwalking into conflict. Is that still your worry? Do you think they've sort of woken up now?
We always worry. I mean, the good thing is that both sides have made very clear they do not want to enter into conflict, that they are looking at a new phase in their relationship where they want to manage differences, avoid competition from escalating into conflict. And that's positive. But as I mentioned just now, the fundamental differences have not changed. America considers China its strategic rival, and it has stated very clearly that it wants to not just have a lead in technology for 1 or 2 bounds, but an absolute lead, as far a lead as possible. And the more America takes action in that direction, the more China will feel, well, you are really just trying to keep me down permanently, to contain me, and that will elicit a reaction from China. So the risk of us moving into a more bifurcated and balkanized world still remains.
You're referring on that to the kind of chip war, so to speak, especially the recent Biden declaration, the new rules about chips, which make it very difficult for anyone to work with both America and China.
It's chips, it's technology, it's also trade and supply chains. On both sides, trade and technology, I think there are legitimate concerns around security. There are legitimate concerns about building greater resilience in the supply chain. But if you carry the arguments too far, then I think there will be many unintended and far-reaching consequences that will make all of us worse off.
Does that mean, when I was here last, it was very obvious, and they've said this publicly, but it was very obvious that Singapore, Indonesia, the region, took a very dim view of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Do you think it's the same thing about the semiconductor deal, that it's something that is seen as overly aggressive against China?
Well, like I said, we recognize that there may well be areas of legitimate security concerns. But if you, I mean, you can make the argument that everything is dual use, really. And so how far does that go? I mean, if you can keep it and be very careful about defining your security interests and limiting these to areas of critical technologies where there are legitimate security interests, I think there will be more countries that understand America's position and will be prepared to support that. But once it gets more and more far-reaching, I think there will be concern from many countries in Southeast Asia. And the same goes for dealing with supply chains. If there are critical dependencies in essential areas and there is a need for more diversification, well and good. I mean, all of us would support that. We constantly look at diversifying our import sources, which is why when our neighbors banned the export of live chickens to Singapore, we did not flap, because we've got many alternatives.
Very good pun, by the way.
For frozen chickens.
Yeah.
But diversification is not decoupling.
But you're in a strange position on the chip makers, because at least in principle, you could imagine that Southeast Asia, this region, gaining because chip making is now going to move away from China and Taiwan.
No, so we can see why companies and investors might want to diversify their exposures in Asia and look at smarter diversification, look at setting up more manufacturing in Southeast Asia. Certainly many Southeast Asian countries will welcome that. But I think if diversification becomes decoupling and you have separate supply chains, different technology circles which cannot interact with one another, countries will have to choose sides, and no one wants to be in that position.
We'll come back to choosing sides in a second, but surely the world that you will inherit will be one where there's two tech ecosystems. There is an American ecosystem and there is a Chinese tech ecosystem, and you either have to keep a foot in both, or you can't sit in the middle.
There already is evolving two separate ecosystems in some critical areas of technology, but I'm talking about how this might become more pervasive across even, very straightforward matters of, because the entire technology supply chain is such a global network now. It's not like in the days of the Cold War. So if you're talking about a complete separation, nothing in my ecosystem can be made in another ecosystem. No single component at all. I think we are talking about a major separation which will not only impact Singapore, it will impact the whole world and companies everywhere.
In terms of America, I mean, America keeps on coming to this region. We had Catherine Tai this week with this rather kind of wonderful argument that, will you come and join them in their non-existent trade pacts? How could America improve its
Don't be so cynical. No, we understand, as we've had this conversation before, we know the constraints of domestic politics in the US. We would like to have trade, we would like to have market access. It's not possible now. We encourage the US administration to keep these options open at a suitable time down the road. If the opportunity arises, do consider it. But meanwhile, there are many areas we can cooperate on around the green economy, the digital economy, supply chains, and including green financing and many things that America can do in Southeast Asia.
Do you think, though, that America is losing that part of the economic argument because it isn't coming? It has a group of countries, including Singapore, who are sympathetic to many of the more democratic parts of the American message, perhaps even a little bit scared of Chinese hegemony. And yet, as long as America keeps on coming back here without the kind of economic frameworks that you and other countries, perhaps other countries in this region more, because they're less developed.
Sure.
It's making it hard for America to win that battle.
Which is why we have been a consistent advocate for America to strengthen its economic cooperation and put meat on the framework of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which they have introduced and implemented. It's a framework now, but it needs meat. And that means looking at each of the pillars of cooperation and pursuing concrete projects. And it is happening. The ministers have been meeting for 1 or 2 rounds, and I think there are some concrete projects that are being discussed. So it is promising, and there's something on the table. It's not just talk.
What about China? Do you see any change in China's attitude now that Xi has somewhat miraculously been elected to a 3rd term?
Well, I think both US and China have cleared some of the domestic politics that they had to go through, and for the Chinese Communist Party and for Xi Jinping, now that the Party Congress is over, they have consolidated, made very clear their new leadership team. They will be very focused on setting the direction for China's economy going forward. They have medium and long-term goals very clearly set out, but their immediate challenge is to get out of COVID-0 and deal with some of the very real challenges in the near term, including debt and property markets.
But in the past, certainly go back a year or so, there were kind of mumblings out of places like Singapore that China was overreaching. There was talk of trying to interfere in domestic politics, those sort of things. Now that Xi Jinping is more safely ensconced, do you think that might change?
It's hard to say. I mean, all countries, as they become bigger and more larger in size, more developed, look to become more assertive in their foreign policy and to assert their national interests. This is not unique to China at all. As a small country, Singapore experiences this all the time.
Something which would be unique, and which is certainly something which is on everybody's minds here, the chances of China invading Taiwan. What kind of odds do you put that at?
Well, President Biden made clear this after his meeting with Xi Jinping as well, that he didn't see any imminent threat of an invasion in the near term. And I think that's a readout we got from the meetings that they had. And we think that's the case because China and President Xi now have so many immediate domestic preoccupations. Why would they want to do something like this? But having said that, for China, Taiwan is a red line. And President Xi made it as clear as possible to President Biden. It's a red line. It's, in fact, the reddest of red lines, because for China, Taiwan is about sovereignty. It's about territorial integrity. So China cannot have America talk about 2 Chinas. There is 1 China, and after all, this was the basis of the 1972 agreement as well.
And do you think but isn't it one of those debates where you can see the different people? You can see America, China, Taiwan, the 3 main parties. They are all repeatedly saying they want to keep the status quo, whilst at the same time slightly salami cutting a little bit more. Each time they're just trying to change the debate slightly.
Which is why I mentioned at the start of our conversation that this is just the beginning of a long process. Because on China, indeed, everyone is saying the right things, but maneuvering for maximum advantage. And that's not helpful because accidents can happen, miscalculations can happen. And that's why it's so important for both sides to come together, sit down, have a clear understanding of where the red lines are, communicate with one another, and have that level of communication, not just at the very top, but across all levels, including amongst the military.
Your foreign minister's nice phrase about you could have overlapping circles of friends. Do you worry that you're heading towards a world where it's harder to have overlapping circles of friends?
We do. That's why we are very encouraged by this first conversation that took place between President Xi and President Biden. And that's why we think the lesson from Ukraine is not to wait till conflict happens. That's too late. The lesson is really to start thinking now about what can we do in Asia to develop a framework of cooperation that will maximize our chances for continued stability and prosperity. And to us, that means having a framework where we can have overlapping circle of friendships, where people can do business with many parties, and we want all the major powers to have stakes in Southeast Asia and to do business here in Southeast Asia.
One kind of consequence of what's happening at the moment is that people have been leaving Hong Kong and coming to Singapore, especially a lot of Chinese, mainland Chinese money seems to be coming here. You have a vast number of family offices have grown. There's a lot of other things coming here. I know you will tell me immediately that Singapore has nothing but the best interests of Hong Kong at its heart.
We want them to succeed.
You want them to succeed, but for better or worse, you are getting a lot of their money. Now, if that money is coming here, it does cause you problems. It causes you worries about inequality. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. We will always keep Singapore an open economy. There is no alternative for us. After all, the whole basis of the Singapore story is one of the triumph of openness. And that's why it's so important, even existential, for us to keep ourselves open. But we know that there are downsides to an open economy, which is why the government is not, we are clear-eyed about the challenges, and we will deal with these downsides. The downsides includes dealing with making sure Singaporeans can have access to affordable housing.
Yeah.
The downsides includes looking at how we can ensure inclusive growth, dealing with income and wealth inequalities, and also continuing to invest in Singaporeans so that we give them all that maximum advantage to excel and do well in an open economy.
That's part of the problem, though, isn't it? You only have, you have a small amount of space. By definition, property values, rents. The rent is the most common word I have heard in Singapore these past 3 days.
Yes.
There is a pressure in that direction.
Yes. That impacts more the people, foreign professionals who are looking to rent, but it does have an impact on competitiveness. But prices are also a concern with regards to affordability. Fortunately, we do have in Singapore public housing that caters to 80% of Singaporeans. We can keep prices affordable. But we monitor this very, very closely, the entire property market, as well as affordable housing for Singaporeans, because it's such an integral part of our compact. And because, as you say, Singapore is so small, and if we don't keep a close watch over it, we can easily, a lot of the foreign investments into property can easily bring about, a huge problem for us.
The subject imbalances and openness. One of the things Singapore has been very open to is crypto. As you know, there have been one or two upsets.
We are open to digital innovation and digital asset innovation, but we are not open to crypto speculation at all.
You're one of the biggest crypto centers in the world, though, aren't you? You might call it digital money, but you're open to these things. You are the founder of FTX, took part in the central bank's FinTech festival, taken part in Bloomberg festivals as well. But
yes.
What's happened the past couple of weeks in the crypto market, does that give you any cause for concern in that particular area?
Well, it has just reinforced our perception, our views that we were on the right track to go big on digital assets innovation, which is an important enabler and I think something that potentially can transform financial markets, cross-border payments, settlements, capital markets. A lot of potential there. But, and we've said this for a long time, even when people criticized us for saying that, which was that we need to take a strong stance against crypto speculation and trading, especially by retail investors. So we had put out, even before FTX happened, we had put out a consultation paper on tightening regulatory rules around this aspect, right? On crypto trading, on retail investors' access to crypto. We plan to tighten. We had put out a consultation paper, and we will review the rules that are necessary. But we will continue to embrace innovation around digital assets, which we think has tremendous potential.
And you say it's part of a kind of necessary shakeout for the crypto industry. It's part of the maturing of the crypto.
Partly, but in the FTX case, there are very serious allegations that amount to potential fraud even. So it's not just about its governance, it's a whole range of issues, and we'll have to see what happens with the investigations. But I think there was a bit of a bubble, and now we are starting to see some shaking out as well.
Can I ask you a bit about openness as well? You are the next face of Singapore, and you talked about Singapore being more open. It's famously open financially, a little bit less socially. The last time we were here, we talked about the laws on homosexuality being revised.
Yeah, we have a big debate on this later in Parliament.
And now that's gone through, but there are
Not yet. It's coming in Parliament at the end of this month.
But are there other things where you think Singapore could open up a bit further?
Sure. Well, there is no question that we are becoming a very diverse society, and there will be segments in Singapore with different views. People will desire more openness socially as well. But because it's a very diverse society, the different segments in Singapore will value different aspects, including stability, security, the fact that the children can go out safely at night, and these are important things to them as well. So how do we balance between these different considerations? I think society will evolve and the government will continue to engage citizens and see how best to represent their aspirations.
Any chances, I just saw Thailand has just decriminalized cannabis. You take famously rather a tougher attitude. That would make your name.
Yeah. I'm not out to make a name for myself. I'm here to make sure that Singapore continues to succeed and do well for many more generations to come.
Well, Lawrence, you have admirably done that. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you very much for hosting the New Economy Forum here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Please welcome Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Arab Republic of Egypt and President of COP27, Sama Shukri. And our moderator, anchor for Bloomberg Television, Manus Cranny.
Minister, a very good afternoon. Welcome to the NEF 2022, and thank you for taking time away from the crowds at Sharm el-Sheikh. At the start of this COP, the UN Secretary General said, "We're on a highway to climate hell. Our foot is on the accelerator." You're coming to the close, and we're trying to get the deals over the line. Are we tapping the brakes in Sharm el-Sheikh? Or are we taking our foot off the gas? Minister.
That's certainly not the presidency's perspective or the presidency's objective. Our objective is to maintain the focus on climate action, that all parties should undertake their responsibilities, fulfill their commitments, and demonstrate the necessary ambition to go forward with the process and to achieve deliverables that can have a definitive impact on the climate change agenda. It is up to the parties to demonstrate the political will that was expressed by their leaders during the summit on the 7th and the 8th, and that political will should be translated in the negotiating rooms and should show the necessary flexibility and accommodations by all to move the process forward.
If I say to you, as it stands right now, what are the biggest wins, and between the close of business of this gathering, what will be the biggest victory? How would you define that at this juncture?
Well, I believe that overall, in all of the areas, whether it is mitigation, adaptation, finance, or loss and damage, we must demonstrate during this COP that there is a movement and an inertia towards deliverables. And we want to maintain what was achieved in Paris and subsequently in Glasgow, but to demonstrate also that there is a path forward that we will provide for the COP28 the necessary platforms to achieve more in doing what we need all to do collectively with the principles of common responsibility and differentiated capabilities, that this collective will is demonstrated in impactful measures.
We have the initial cover decision, I understand, and the top line on that, COP holds off on its pledge to phase down oil and gas. Now, of course, India, we know, put on the table they wanted to phase out, and the US talked about phasing down projects that were unabated. What has been the biggest obstacle to having that language and not something stronger?
If you could repeat, I couldn't hear you very well.
I've seen the cover decision. We've written a story today that COP holds off on pledging to phase down oil and gas. What is the biggest obstacle to that?
Again, the covering decision is still in the process of being formulated. Whatever circulation you might have seen is still a work in progress, and I don't think one should jump to any conclusions. We are still in a phase of deliberations to see how best to provide an outcome, a covering decision that, while responds to the interests of parties, does not provide any form of backtracking or relinquishing of any previous commitments.
So you're optimistic that we can still see some stronger language?
Well, we are working diligently as President to encourage all to rise to the occasion, to show the necessary ambition, and to maintain the momentum.
Loss and damage has been much talked about from the very start of this COP, and some would say it is perhaps the most controversial issue of all. Are you still hopeful that you can get something meaningful on loss and damage? And maybe you could define for me what you would see as meaningful.
Well, definitely. I think in the incorporation of the item on the agenda in itself is a progress that should not be diminished after 27, 28 years of discussion and deliberation and lack of conversion. To have it on the agenda, I think, is a recognition of the now common understanding by all of the absolute necessity to deal with this agenda item.
Do you think you've laid the groundwork for a new compensation fund? Will there be a new fund?
Well, the issue, of course, is rather complex, and as you know, there is a divergent views on the best way forward and what constitutes the financial facility that might be agreed to. All of this is a matter for the parties to deliberate, to discuss, and to reach a point of convergence on. But there is strong positions by a vast number of the parties, especially in the developing world, that seeks a positive outcome that can demonstrate again, a recognition of the issue and a commitment to addressing it.
Well, commitment is laudable. Money is what delivers change in every walk of life. Are China and India ready to pay in and deliver funds to loss and damage? What progress, if at all, from those two countries?
Well, you'd have to refer to them to express whatever position. My role is to encourage all to come to a point of convergence and compromise that provides that this is a viable context, that the COP still is capable of dealing with the issues of climate change. And I think what we have witnessed this year in devastating weather patterns and the floodings in Pakistan has highlighted the need for addressing loss and damage and also recognizing that it has become a central issue within the climate change agenda.
Is it still realistic for this audience and for the world to believe that we can get and limit global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and ideally 1.5?
Well, I think we have no other alternative but to continue to put faith and to demonstrate our ability to deal with climate change and to put in place the necessary procedures, whether for mitigation or adaptation. Many have referred to the intervention of the dinosaur during this COP and the potential of extinction of humanity if we continue to address matters within the narrow national interests and relinquish what is an existential threat to all of humanity.
And on that point of adaptation, I mean, many people have said to me, based in the Middle East, that this was going to be an African COP, and in many ways, the adaptation that the world is hoping for, again, comes back to delivery of cash and capital. The EU are putting in €1 billion for adaptation, the 60 million for loss and damage. When you see that number, does that show leadership, or does that show the gap and the distance that we have to go?
It certainly highlights the gap, and it certainly shows, on the one hand, that there is a desire to provide the necessary finance, but I think all are in unison that there is a substantial gap, especially when it comes to adaptation, that the provision of finance to African countries and to others. This is a COP held on African soil, but it is a COP of the parties. And the issue of adaptation and the provision of finance and the resources that can be available, whether through public or private or through the international financial institutions, must be enhanced and must be provided in terms of concessionary loans and to take into account the developmental objectives of the developing countries and especially Africa. So much more has to be done, and we recognize that this COP is being convened under global circumstances, economic global circumstances, that has put additional pressure on the resources available.
And that additional pressure is also from the war between Ukraine and Russia, as Europe looks for alternative sources to gas. Frans Timmermans today, over the past couple of days, has said gas can play a transitional role for Africa. It can be part of the development to a green economy. But the detractors would say, well, the EU is just using Africa as a gas station. And it's going to leave Africa with a lot of fossil fuel kit. Is the EU treating Africa as a gas station?
Well, I believe that we have always discussed the issue of just transition, and at the same time, the current pressures associated with the Ukrainian crisis is having an impact, but that impact should in no way provide opportunity for backtracking, nor should it also limit our ability to, for developing countries, for African countries, to continue on the path of sustainable development, while they have on every occasion demonstrated their willingness to a just transition, provided the resources, provided the exchange of technology. But until now, there is a deficiency that and a gap that has to be fulfilled.
You will hand the baton across to the UAE. The question, I suppose, we'll see what is resolved in Sharm el-Sheikh by the end of the week. But as you hand over to the UAE, what do you think 2023 will be? What do you think will be in the hands of the UAE to carry forward from what you've achieved?
Well, there are areas that we are providing the platform and basis, legally issues to be fulfilled in the Emirates. Among them is the global goal on adaptation, and to carry through on what will be addressed in terms of loss and damage during this session, and that might be further refined, developed, and agreed upon in the Emirates.
Time is of the essence here, and I want to get through another couple of issues. For loss and damage, what's the one thing that you hope happens before the close of business in Sharm el-Sheikh this week?
Well, my hopes are unlimited. My ambitions are unlimited, but I have to also be practical and be guided by the ability of the parties to reach a consensus that they should show flexibility and they should reflect the political will of their leaders. When they spoke in the summit, many recognized the importance of loss and damage and the importance of providing the financial facility necessary to impact and to have an ability to address the needs of various countries that have been impacted. We hope that the political will demonstrated by the leaders will trickle down to the negotiators, and thereby there will be a higher degree of ambition.
We're just about to speak to the President of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky. The audience, it's packed. You've had a tough time. Food prices, infrastructure. You've been at the tough end also of this war. What is your message to Mr. Zelensky, who is waiting in the other Zoom room?
Well, definitely the whole world has been impacted by the war in Ukraine, and as an Arab country that is part of the Arab Contact Group that has visited both Russia and met with the Ukrainian officials to provide an opportunity for a political resolution of this conflict. We are continuing to advocate for a political resolution that can fulfill the maintenance of Ukrainian sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity, and deals with all of the outstanding issues that have initiated this conflict.
But with that in mind, you have negotiated, you're one of the constants in foreign policy in Egypt. What is the building block to delivering an off-ramp here? What is the most important thing the world can do to help convene some kind of a road away from war?
Well, certainly it is a matter of the political will that can be demonstrated by those involved in the conflict, but also by the international community and utilizing the mechanisms that are available. There are several mechanisms, there are several countries that are closely involved and have offered their good offices, and it is really time to utilize them to the best possible for the benefit of international peace and security.
Minister, thank you for taking the time. I hope to see you in your office in Cairo again. Quite an impressive office, I've got to say. That is the Minister for the President for COP27, Sami Shukri, joining us here. I hand over to our Editor-in-Chief now for the conversation to carry forward. Excellency.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Editor-in-Chief of Bloomberg Editorial and Research, John Micklethwaite.
Thank you very much. Our final guest does not need much of an introduction. Volodymyr Zelensky, the President of Ukraine, has been in many of our thoughts and also a lot of the news, not just over the past 48 hours, but over most of the past year, very depressingly. We have a lot of questions for the President, both about the events of the past few days, the end of the war, and of course the bigger issue of the economic reconstruction of Ukraine. But first he's asked for the chance to address this forum briefly. So we'll hand over to him. As I think most of you know, you do have headsets underneath your seats. Channel 2 is Mandarin, Channel 3 is Ukrainian, and Channel 4 is English. Thank you very much. President Zelensky, welcome to the New Economic Forum. You are here. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, John. Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention to Ukraine. Our today's conversation finalizes practically the work of your forum, and this is very symbolic because the global situation will directly depend on when and how the Russian aggression will finish. You can see how many threats have been provoked by this aggression to the world. I'll give you just 3 examples, but there are more of them, much more than 3. Just now there was yet another terrorist attack. In the morning, dozens of missiles hitting civil targets predominantly. Russia is hitting the electricity and heat for people, heating power stations and other energy infrastructure. This is the daily reality in Ukraine, the Russian terror. This is why we're contributing so much effort to get the modern air defense and anti-missile defense from the partners. Plus, we have more than 1,000 kilometers of front warfare. What does it mean from the global point of view? Instead of investing trillions of dollars in the development of the human capital, the world is going to spend huge amount of money to re-equip their weaponry. Additionally, now everyone is watching very carefully how we are defending ourselves in Ukraine, looking at the performance of the weapons, which tactics would work better, which defense systems perform the best. To be honest, just several countries could have been doing the same in terms of protecting themselves from aggression with the same intensity as we are doing this. It's just they don't have so many shells and weapons to do this. But potential aggressors and potential frozen conflicts that can spark up again are more than such countries that can defend themselves. So that we have a huge deficit of security, because the more forms of terror Russia is using in this war, the more money ultimately will be used in the world for new weapons and protecting themselves, preventing such strikes that we are going through. Another example, instead of focusing most of our attention to green transformation, different governments are looking for cheaper oil supply, gas supply, or coal supply to reduce energy prices. The price of energy and not the purity of energy becomes number 1 for many countries. And this wouldn't have been the case had it not been for Russian aggression and the use of energy resources by Russia as a weapon. The third example, just in a couple of weeks, artificially, we have the threat of famine for dozens of millions of people, not because of the drought or crisis, but because of the blockade of our ports. We are the exporting country of food products. For dozens of years, the world hasn't seen anything similar. Any new catastrophe because of the high prices on food or famine means subtracting more years from global development. You have been discussing many topics during your forum, but how many of them do not depend on what Russia has done or will do with its aggression? Just a few of them. So when Ukraine is proposing the peace formula, this is truly a peace formula, not just for us, but for the whole world. The comprehensive threat requires comprehensive response. Just a simple ceasefire will not do the trick. This is our formula. It has to be sustainable and long-term peace. Just by simple mitigating the crisis caused by Russia will not bring back the stability. We have to dismantle each and every threat. During the Indonesia summit, I presented our proposal of the reliable peace and dismantling of Russian threat, and I'm grateful to all the countries who are supporting the Ukrainian peace formula. And now I would like to give one more argument. What does peace mean? This is very practical. It means saving lives, stabilization, and development in the first place. Joining the rebuilding of Ukraine, many companies and countries are getting additional growth incentives. When we restore our territorial integrity and will have reliable peace, Ukraine will become the reliable source of new global development. This is not just about economy. This is about modern economy. Just to give you 3 more examples, Ukraine is prepared to replace the dirty fossil fuels from Russia with the green energy of ours. We have huge potential in the low-carbon energy sector. Ukraine is capable of becoming a key partner to European Union for the purposes of decarbonization. We can become the suppliers of green hydrogen and green power to Ukraine. Climate conditions, green fields, energy resources, resources of wind and solar will allow us to produce energy at a very low cost. Just 3 years before Russian aggression, we have created 7 gigs of reliable sources, and we have much more capability. Plus, we can produce dozens of million tons of cheap ammonia, plus nuclear energy and power infrastructure, which is connected to the energy grid of the European Union. Now, Russian missile terror is aiming our energy at our energy capabilities. Russia just in one day before yesterday, launched almost 100 missiles against our power infrastructure, and yet today again. So the losses are colossal, but it means that rebuilding will have to be a large-scale project, and I'm inviting your countries and your companies to start joining this rebuilding initiative. We have the decision of one of the biggest Australian investment groups who committed first $500 million into the green growth of Ukraine under 25 billion rebuilding facility of Ukraine. And I'm grateful to Mr. Andrew Forrest for his decision to be the first, and Larry Fink from BlackRock in helping to structure this fund. Another example is resources. A modern economy needs lithium, graphite, and other rare metals. In some of these resources, we have the biggest deposits in Europe, and this is in itself is a colossal opportunity, plus transport capability, machine building capacity, our culture of labor, and access to the lead markets of the world. So this is the basis of the growth that everyone needs. The third, the agricultural sector. The world knows that without Ukrainian agricultural export, the challenge of food supplies cannot be resolved. And we've just made the decision of extending our grain supply 120 days. But we want to have unlimited duration of this initiative. Plus, we have initiated the Grain from Ukraine program so that together with partners, we could produce and give as much food support to the poorest countries as we can. But bringing back peace to Ukraine means that we will not just be able to stabilize the market in response to the crisis, but to safeguard the food stability and prevention of any further crisis. And I just have given 3 examples. There are much more of them. The peace in Ukraine is a global need, not just the peace or simulacra of ceasefire, which Russia would abuse to prepare for the new war, but the real peace. And I know we can achieve this, but for this we have to safeguard the global unity. We have to be protecting the global honesty, impose more pressure on Russia for the terror, and cooperate together with us for the future development. Thank you very much again for your attention. Let us reach reliable peace. Slava Ukraini.
President Zelensky, thank you very much. You have
Thank you.
You have given a very eloquent defense of Ukraine's position and of your future possibilities can we just clear one thing up at the beginning? The rocket that landed in Poland, you know that Poland, the United States, and others are saying that it appears to be one of your defensive rockets. I think it's clear no one blames you for this. You were trying to shoot down Russian missiles as they came in. But you have, as far as I can see, insisted that the rocket that hit Poland was fired by Russia. I wonder if you still stand by that.
Thank you for this question. First of all, everyone has to understand that there were about 100 missiles that were launched on that day. And I'm grateful for the world for the support of Ukraine with air defense and anti-missile defense. But nevertheless, you can see what are the consequences and aftermath of the Russian war. This is not the first time that the whole missile, a piece of missile of Russia falls down on the territory of another country. Some time ago, the same thing happened. The pieces of the Russian missiles fell on the territory of Moldova, and it was aiming at Ukrainian territory. I don't know what happened this time. We don't know 100%. I think the world also doesn't know what happened 100% in that situation. But I'm sure that this is a Russian missile, and I'm sure that we were launching the air defense missiles, but we can't say specifically that this was the air defense of Ukraine, although we are grateful for not being blamed because we are fighting against Russian missiles on our territory. But nevertheless, we have to be fair and honest. Until the investigation is over, we can't say what kind of missile or what pieces of which missile fell on the Polish territory. What we have seen, the pictures, the diameter of the hole, shows that it couldn't have been just the remnants of the air defense. That's what the military told me. But again, I would like to emphasize that the most important is for the investigation to take place. Yesterday, we insisted for us to be part of joint international investigative group, and late at night we got the confirmation, and early in the morning our professionals will go to the site and will be part of this professional investigation.
Thank you for clearing that up. Since the summer, your military has made enormous progress in regaining your territory, most obviously Kherson. I suppose the question I have for you is, what about Crimea, which Vladimir Putin annexed in 2014? Is your war aim now to retake Crimea, or would merely taking back the Donbass be enough?
Thank you for this question. Our war is the war for our lives. First, you do remember the scale of occupation by Russia of our territory and what happened since the 24th of February. And our objective was to stay strong and bring back the life and peace on our land. Unless we deoccupy our whole territory, this will not bring peace to us. Unfortunately, this is the leader of Russian Federation. This is his decision. We see this. They don't want Ukraine to develop. Ukraine has chosen its way forward, and it will develop. And it is developing. In some areas, we're developing faster, even during the war, than Russia Federation, which doesn't have war on its soil. And so for the stability of the situation for our country, we have to take certain steps. And I think that restoration of territorial integrity of our country is one of those important steps to be made, and also the support of international community investments and etc.
To be absolutely clear about it, deoccupying, as you put it, includes Crimea. It is an important difference, because it would be taking the border back to where it was, the effective border where it was in 2014. Is that your starting point before peace can happen?
The Crimea is part of Ukraine. This is not just a state within a state. It's part of our country and part of our sovereignty. Therefore, indeed, the occupation of the Crimea and Donbass will bring the end to the war.
What is your estimate now for when the fighting might end? You just talked about a long-term peace. When might the fighting end?
As of now, we've deoccupied one big regional capital that Russia managed to occupy since the 24th of February, the only one that they occupied, and that's Kherson. It's a big territory. Kherson region, in terms of area, can fit several countries of the world, and that's a big and important territory to Ukraine. So the next steps are difficult because there's Donbass, there is Kharkiv Oblast. We almost deoccupied the whole Kharkiv Oblast. So the Donbass and the Crimea, and also the left bank of the Dnieper River, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is being occupied, Zaporizhzhia Oblast. So no one can tell that this will happen tomorrow. But I would ask the question, who does this depend on? Right now, I heard the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt, and I took note. He said, the resolution of war depends on the political will of those who are involved in the conflict. He said it very carefully, as any political figure. We are not involved in the conflict, and I would like just to respond to that. We were involved by Russian Federation. They came into our territory. Our political will since the very beginning was to deal with this in a diplomatic manner. So our political will doesn't determine the end of the war. We didn't start anything to want to end it. Of course we want to end the war. We want Russia to go away. So it depends on the political will of the Russian Federation. To be honest, not even the Russian Federation, but a group of people who manage and lead Russian Federation. So the time of putting the end to the war depend on them. On our side, if there is that political will on their side, we will. If there is no political, we will go forward and continue deoccupying our territory. That's one. Two, it also depends on what Egypt has demonstrated, that this is not just resolving an issue or a challenge. This is the war with its own crisis, a crisis that spread to the whole world. It was done not only to Ukraine, and the countries should acknowledge this, not to be afraid and not just to say conflict instead of war. And then this war, with the joint support of international community, will be resolved in a very swift manner.
You said in October that you are potentially open to talks with Russia, but not while Vladimir Putin is president. Does that really make sense? Putin is the president, short of the Russians removing him. That means there is no chance of peace talks whilst he is still president. Do you still stick by that?
As I said, if Russia does another referendum, pseudo-referendum that is not acknowledged by anyone in the world, if they acknowledge our territories as their territories, the leader with such position will not be acknowledged by us, me as a president cannot have any negotiations with him. That's what I said. And they conducted the referendum, and I said there's no point of talking to this person. There's no point. He will not change his policy. This is the occupying policy. He's talking about peace, just like he said, just during the G20. And on that same day, just with this audacity, he launches 100 strikes against Ukraine. What can we talk about? Putin is not one person. These are several people, and there's nothing to talk about with these several people today. If tomorrow they are prepared to take the peace formula, if they are ready to withdraw from our territory, deoccupy Ukraine, and acknowledge that this is a tragedy and not just a mistake, that this is a tragedy of them being aggressors. If they are ready to compensate, or as it is prescribed in the peace formula, if they are ready to accept it, only then we can start thinking about talking to this group of people. And if in Russia there will be other people who would be prepared on the diplomatic level to acknowledge the peace formula in any format, but first of all acknowledge our territorial integrity, that we are a subject, that we are the same people as they are, that they will have to acknowledge that you can't destroy Ukrainians, you can't rape people, you can't kill children. If such people will appear in Russia, we are ready to talk to them, of course.
You've described very accurately the way that the Ukrainian economy has got hit, contracted by, I think, 30% of the past year. You have inflation at 26%. You've got around 40% of your power facilities out in the attacks. The question of how you get the economy going again, what are the industries you want to focus on? And you have an audience of investors. Where is the place that you most want investment from abroad and help from abroad?
Thank you for this question. First of all, I think that we're doing all we can, and the world is helping us in protecting the sky, and 40% of our energy infrastructure was hit, so energy is very relevant. Also, gas production is another priority sector. We have not shrinked our IT sector. It's growing, to the contrary. So some of the technologies that we have developed before the full-fledged aggression, some of the technologies really triggered. We have the stability in the IT sector. We were protected from cyber attacks. There was a huge number of cyber attacks, and they continued. We still stand strong, so all services are still operating in Ukraine, the banking system, etc. So IT sector is developing very strongly. Also, because of the war, we have a very strong development of the technologies. We said that we're going to build the fleet of sea drones, and many of such things are being developed, and here we see a huge potential. And agriculture as one of the key and areas, of course. So we are very open. We invite everyone to come, all the areas starting from extraction to technologies. I think your investments will be strengthened not only by your will, but also by our protection. We have started discussion with the World Bank. Yesterday we had a meeting with the vice president of the World Bank, and we are saying that the World Bank, and we will start the pilot with them to ensure investments in Ukraine. I think that will contribute as well, and that would give assurance to the business to invest in Ukraine.
You mentioned the grain deal and the exports of grain, and that looks as if it's sort of going to roll over. The other big issue is fertilizer. You produce a lot of the world's fertilizer, and everyone is worried about the fact it's stuck, including Russian fertilizer. Do you think there is room for a deal on that as well?
Thank you for this question. Grain deal is already extended. This is not negotiated, it's already a fact. 4 months more, as I said in my statement, but one of the items of the peace formula is that it has to be unrestricted. Apart from the grain deal, you have to understand we have grown strongly in logistics. We have built different pathways during this war in the several months, and that's another area where the investments could come, and we invite them. But also the processing industry. You're talking, so I think you mentioned the ammonia transit. I said that we can agree to this only if the humanitarian aspect of exchange of all our soldiers to all their soldiers. We don't want to trade with Russia and help them because this is our enemy, and unless they change the tactics, this is not possible. The only where we can talk about the UN, about the chemicals, about the fertilizers, I explained this to the General Secretary, and all the partners know this. Only if we will exchange all the captives, our captives for their captives.
Ukraine is dependent on foreign financial aid. The European Union has, I think it's roughly $3 billion a month, and yet some people think the European Union has been quite slow to deliver the money it's promised. Why won't Brussels move faster to help you?
First of all, we're grateful to all the partners for the financial assistance they provide. We do have a deficit in the budget, and of course, the economy during the war is not working as it used to work before, and how it will work after the war. So the 3 billion per month from European Union is what we're getting. We're not getting. We would be grateful if we could have received them, but we are grateful for what we already have. We're getting from EU partners, from Great Britain, from Canada, big assistance from the United States, and several other governments bilaterally from the European Union, ad hoc assistance. It goes slowly because there is this institutional aspects and bureaucracy, of course. Of course, we would want to do it faster. We're now discussing with the EU to close the deficit gap for 2023 and the support for the Ukrainian budget in the amount of 18 billion next year. Ursula von der Leyen confirmed this capability and the political will to do so, and that we'll be able to get that. But we are during the war. This is why, as the president of the country at war, I would like to say that we're all grateful, but I have to be more pragmatic. Until we get it, I can't say that we got it. So, but we believe in this.
Can I ask you to move from the pragmatism of your current situation, which everyone understands? You're at war, you're under attack. But if you look forward to Ukraine after the war, how will Ukraine be different after the war than it was before. To give you one example, many of us, when we came to Ukraine, one persistent worry was corruption. Will the new Ukraine that everyone admires so much at the moment, but the Ukraine that emerges from the war, will it be different like that? You famously ran for president not to fight a war, but to get rid of corruption. How will Ukraine be different in 4 or 5 years?
First of all, there will not be political influence of Russia on Ukraine, and secondly, there will not be influence of Russian capital. They withdrawn from our companies. We've pushed them out. The political parties that they were influencing are banned, and they will not participate in the next election. So the information or influence on our development and geopolitical direction will not be there as well. And this is very important because that shapes the independence of our country and also investments and the condition with corruption. There will be no corruption. We don't have it now, of course, because we're all united around our country. Many people, corrupt people, have left the country with their money, and we will do our best for them to stay where they now are. The most important things that we have to focus on, we are united. Only those who want to protect their country. No one will be able to forgive corruption in future after the war, because we've lived through very difficult challenges and war. Technologically, there will be no corruption, because during this time we will have done everything to make sure that it works online. We already have cuts in the management of our government agencies. There should be less government in the business, so this is why we're doing all services digitally. So we started this with COVID because of the pandemics, but during the war we have boosted this with new dynamic. So all the services are going to be electronic, so there will not be contact with the civil servants, and there will not be pressure on business. And this talks about the independence of economy and transparency of investments. And these are the most important things. I think that many people who have left Ukraine, many families with children and students who want to come back and build their country based on different values, then I think that this will be a completely different country where I would like to welcome you to come.
Well, I think if you are fighting a war, it is always good to have a dream, and I hope that you realize yours. President Zelensky, thank you very much for talking to the New Economy Forum. Thank you very much for talking to Bloomberg, and I'm sure the audience would like to give you a round of applause. Thank you.
What I would like to say is that this is not a dream. This is a deferred reality.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Please welcome back to the stage for our closing, Eric Schatzker.
Ladies and gentlemen, believe it or not, that brings us to the end of our show. We began this journey 3 days ago with the words of Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. You'll recall from our opening video, we have to keep trying and trying and trying. The world must stand up if our citizens are to live a better life. I can't imagine a more appropriate way to close out the New Economy Forum than by showing our deep respect for the suffering and the courage of the Ukrainian people, and by absorbing the inspiring words of their leader, President Zelensky. Mike Bloomberg acknowledged the incredible work of the Bloomberg New Economy team in his remarks this morning. Please join me in thanking them for the creativity and Herculean effort it takes to make this event so successful and so memorable. Our program featured 82 exceptional speakers, the vast majority of whom traveled here from across the globe. Please join me in thanking them for their generosity. They've shown us all by sharing such provocative ideas and revealing insights. I'd also like to thank our founding partners, our presenting partners, our spotlight economy partners, and our knowledge partners. Your support not only makes the New Economy Forum possible, it truly means everything to us. And I'd like to say a special thanks to our host partner, Singapore, for welcoming us so warmly and for always making our stay here such a pleasure. And then there's all of you, our delegates. We've challenged you to reckon, to rebuild, and to revive, and you've answered our call. Thank you. We want your feedback, and I encourage you to, to complete the survey that you'll be receiving shortly. On April 18th and 19th of 2023, we will convene the inaugural Bloomberg New Economy Gateway Europe in Ireland, together with our partners at IDA Ireland. Our guiding theme, folks, is re-globalization. Trade is as essential as ever to the new economy. But there's no going back to the old globalization. Re-globalization will be different. Join us in Ireland as we investigate how. And as Mike announced this morning, we'll convene the first ever Bloomberg New Economy Gateway Africa in Morocco in June. Our focus there will be resilience and sustainability. I hope you'll join us in Morocco as well. Over the past 3 days, I've seen extraordinary conversations here on the main stage. I've watched breakout sessions bubble over with interest and enthusiasm, and I've witnessed new connections being made and old friendships renewed. This is why we believe it's so important to bring people together. I could tell you all about the amazing things that happened here at the 2022 Bloomberg New Economy Forum, but having spent much of my quarter century at Bloomberg in television, I learned a valuable lesson long ago. Let the pictures do the talking.
We live in a world of shocks. So many crises all at once. It's time to take a hard look at these challenges and what it might take to escape them. This is day one of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, Reckoning.
For 5 years now, this forum has brought together leaders with big, ambitious ideas and the power to make a difference. The forum is dedicated not only to open dialogue, but also to action in global finance, commerce, sustainability, resilience, and security.
世界和平稳定符合中华民族根本利益。
Open dialogue between the two sides make a big contribution.
However, in times like this, cooperation is important, not decoupling.
The energy transition, pandemic preparedness, potential growth, preventing a rollback in the developing world.
Those of you who know Bloomberg New Economy know our mission is to create a platform for engagement and open dialogue. Mike talked about this.
The U.S.-China relationship is of profound consequence, not just to our two countries and our people, but for the entire world.
I will say that the sharing of data is usually important, but it is more important to actually be face-to-face and have the engagement and the dialogue.
I hope that we can come around as a planet to understand that we have to respect the boundaries that the planet sets for us.
Structurally, the trade war with China is a huge loss for humanity.
Digitalization accelerated tremendously.
Paperless government, e-government was a way for me to influence the efficiency of the government, transparency, also fight corruption.
The only way is to produce better products at the same price.
We're ready. This is day 2 of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, Rebuilding.
It's not just technology. I think the CEO today needs to be the person that can see that, but that can also see the aspect, what's the right thing to do, how do you apply it, whose problem are you solving?
The most important thing for us, apart from growing the business today, is to earn trust.
Supply chain redesign, that idea of optionality, more of a matrix approach to build better resilience into the system.
I'm concerned about the world's commitment to net zero, because I think everybody is finding it hard, both technically and financially.
I think the good news is we have most of the technology we need is available.
You need a system to orchestrate. So that's a digital platform for decarbonization.
The most important disclosure a company can make is not their current carbon footprint, it's their transition plan.
Today, we are launching the Bloomberg New Economy Climate Technology Coalition
to help build a better future. This is day 3 of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, Revival.
And I'd argue at least this is the time for courage. And we should not be thinking about retreat, but we should be thinking about reimagining.
On the physical supply of gas, I'm cautiously optimistic.
It's a real pleasure to be here and to join this panel. For 2023, the question is more about how long are you going to keep these rates?
You need that level of communication beyond the personal relationship at the very top. You need more channels of communication for trust to be built.
Today's conversation finalizes practically the work of your forum, and this is very symbolic because the global situation will directly depend on when and how the Russian aggression will finish.
Thank you again. It's been a great week so far, and I hope to see everyone here in 2023, if not before. All the best. Thank you for coming.